welcome to our study, Mipham's Sword of Wisdom, the Nyingma approach to valid cognition. Now, why do we want to study something like that? This sounds very academic, very distant. Wouldn't we want to just settle into meditation, simplicity? Would we really want to go into what we in the Western philosophical tradition refer to as epistemology, which is essentially validating our knowledge, or rather questioning, challenging, investigating our knowledge, and essentially verifying that our knowledge is valid. That, what we call valid cognition, is actually essential for us to have faith in anything. You go to Paris and there's a very nice gentleman who wants to sell you shares in the Eiffel Tower. That's where you need to actually investigate whether or not this is valid. In many ways, as we go, if we buy a house, we need to validate whether it is what the seller pretends that it is, and so forth. This is particularly relevant when it comes to the spiritual path in the modern world. Now, I often give you the example that as far as my car goes, I'm perfectly happy with my mechanic telling me what to do. And I really just want to put the key in the ignition, take off. But that's because I have complete and utter faith in the logic, the technology of the car. I have trust in my mechanic and so forth. But if I didn't have that, then I might be like the people who first time they encountered cars, they put grass out for the car to eat, assuming that there must be something mysterious going on under there that involves some creature that makes that big block of, whatever move. So in my case, I have a complete trust in the process of a car. In many Asian cultures, you have a complete trust in the spiritual path because you've seen it work. You've seen so many people around you. Your whole culture is infused with the wisdom and the, you could say, proof of the validity of this knowledge, this science, this path, this practice. But in the modern culture, it's not quite like that. And not only that, we don't have a background with enlightened or great sages, but we actually have a rather tainted background when it comes to the spiritual. We have, of course, the whole background with you could say, the struggle between Greek rationality and Abrahamic faith, and this sort of journey down through the ages until we have the Age of Enlightenment, as we call it, was really a battle between the church and those who had a hard time understanding exactly how can we believe all these things that the church is proposing, or how can we find the place where rationality and faith can meet. How can we understand the teachings that we have from the scriptures, from the clergy, and so forth, the whole belief system, together with what we can observe in terms of what we can verify empirically. So that's where there was a long history of struggle, and even to this day, this struggle still reverberates. We still have echoes. Just the other day, I was staying with some friends. They had a book by Christopher Hitchens called God is Not Great. And then, of course, you have his mate, Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. So to this very day, there's sort of this rebelling against what somebody felt they were cheated. There was something going on, and it's just not right. And of course, yes, we have a long, you could say, cultural history with great edifices, churches, cathedrals, and so on that celebrate that. So it's predictable that there's a lot of respect and a lot of sentimentality around this institution and so forth. But anyway, it doesn't actually quite, you could say, click with, let's say, science. And so the Age of Enlightenment was the freeing of science in the modern world. All of a sudden, you had the likes of Francis Bacon and René Descartes, who all of a sudden, David Hume and so forth, who, well, while Hume was an atheist, actually René Descartes was not. While Hume was immensely critical of the church, then René Descartes was actually just a good Christian, but he wanted to be able to work on what he saw the creation of God, which was then seeing the world in terms of just being something God had created, and then operating from the point of view that everything out there that wasn't human was really just some mechanistic construct. And then a science progressed along the lines of just operating with what was referred to as mechanistic reductionism, that we just observe what's out there and we make experiments, we find out how it works. And that became very successful. And as we went through the 18th and 19th centuries, there was this incredible progress, the invention of all sorts of technologies, the steam engine, the combustion engine, and all sorts of incredible inventions, electricity, and the radio, television, the nuclear power and what have you. And all of that really just more and more affirmed that this science was valid. And in that context, the spiritual, which was, you could say, earlier seen as the domain of the church, was left behind as just being a relic of the past for many people, a nice sort of cultural thing that you paid lip service to, but rarely actually viewed as something that presented hard science. And so there's been the notion that when you go into spirituality, you go into something where you should just, it's just about believing, doing whatever they say, and essentially leaving your rationality behind. And in some way, that is true. The scope of the spiritual lies far beyond just the rational linear mind. But at the same time, we operate within a reality that is very much what we where we rely on what we can observe, and on the basis of what we can observe, we believe in it. So if someone says, that the green spaghetti monster, it created the world in a in a few days or whatever, then there's not much really we can do about that. That's essentially what we can't verify. But if somebody says that the laws of gravity, or the metric system and so forth, all of these systems, we can verify their validity. And so there's a lot of trust in the outer sciences, and there's a lot of suspicion around the spiritual. And in addition to, you could say, the inherited suspicion around the spiritual, and there really it all boils down to, you could say, the modern person saying, well, it sounds very nice with his creator, his God, it sounds very nice with the soul, but give me evidence for it. And that's where we have this discussion that essentially is you could say, flawed from the start, because the presumption from the materialist point of view is that it's something that you should be able to prove objectively. It is there. Show me God. Well, where does he live? Man in the sky, and so forth. The soul, well, where is it? We don't see anything. We can't. There's nothing we can measure, quantify, and so forth. So we live in a materialist culture in the sense of we believe that everything is material, matter. And while there are a few camps around this issue, then it's essentially a fragmented field, many different opinions, many different hypotheses and propositions. And when it comes to the spiritual, not only we have that problem, but we also have the notion of the bad behavior from the church, and also a lot of where we have it in New Age context, all sorts of New Age ideas, that sort of basically are products, to a large extent, products of the old belief system. Just, it would be nice to believe this and just chant Om or whatever. And a lot of the traditions from other cultures, shamanism or yoga or Buddhism, gets hijacked by you could say, people who would like to create their own little spiritual path, and essentially operate very much from the the old model of just blind faith. So that's where we have a lot of, you could say, disillusion with regards to we are rightly disappointed and suspicious of the propositions that we have from the past, and also with regards to some of the New Age sort of propositions. So while all of these, you could say, the Buddhist approach to all of this is respect. You know, if people want to believe in one thing or another, absolutely fine. That's not the problem. And when we come to this study here about valid cognition, it's not that we're intending to denigrate or discourage other people, but we are intended for our own sake to generate faith for our own journey. We'd want to generate faith in what we are engaging. When it comes to the Buddhist path, we famously have this quotation from the Buddha, where he, in what we in the Pali Canon call the Kalama Sutta, where a group of villagers, they asked the Buddha, we have so many teachers coming through and they all say one thing after the other, who can we trust? And the Buddha said, with regards to what I teach you, please don't accept it out of respect or faith in my person, but on the basis of your own analysis and inquiry. Just as if you were to purchase gold, you wouldn't accept it at face value, but you would validate on the basis of burning and hammering and so forth, melting it down. You'd validate the authenticity of the gold. So similarly with my teaching. And this is what we then have in the Buddhist teaching, where we interestingly have what exactly coincides with what the 20th century German philosopher of science, Karl Popper, he insisted that science needs to be falsifiable. It means that if we make a proposition, the world was created in 7 days, well, there's not much we can do about that. Somebody says that, but it doesn't really, you know, it's not something we can really, well, it's hard to prove to begin with. But if we say, you know, the universe is just one big thought experiment, you know, how are we going to verify that? And that's where we need to, for something to be actually verifiable, or rather for something to be something we can trust, we need to be able to verify it. You know, the car is in the garage. Well, that's not exactly a metaphysical proposition. You go, you verify, it's there, you know. So that's where, similarly also with everything that we talk about in physics, you know, when kids study physics, they're encouraged to actually verify it on the basis of going to the laboratory and seeing how these chemicals interact and so forth. So that is where then you could say trust in physics emerges on the basis of saying, yes, this stuff actually works. And when we see that works, then we're sort of more, you could say, liable to trust other propositions, such as if somebody says there's a certain amount of kilometers from here to the moon, well, we probably won't be able to go and verify it, but we've already seen the validity and the methodology of this science sufficiently to say, yep, that's probably true. And if somebody comes and says makes another, you know, proposition saying, no, come here, it looks here, it says, look here in the book, it says, the people from NASA or JPL, they have verified it is, you know, this number of miles or kilometers to the moon. So that's where it becomes actually a hard fact. So we have a tremendous trust around what is valid and what is invalid. Same with medicine and so forth. So we have a very successful materialist culture of what we assert as valid. Now, in the present context, we're operating with what is possibly the most verifiable, the most empirical dimension of our reality, interestingly enough. This, of course, we can go into and discuss in some detail or in another time, but let's just face it, the immediate consciousness, this present knowing mind, this cognizant mind, is the most verifiable, immediately, you could say, that which we can experience most immediately. The objects that we see out there, we can verify their nature, and generally we tend to agree with them, agree about them with other people. But the mind, actually has some primacy in terms of what constitutes our reality. So we presently are gathered here in a Buddhist context, studying the mind from the point of view that this is essential for us in order to, this is essential in our existence. This is the most important thing in our existence. And the whole science around the mind that comes down from the Buddha is very interesting, because for 2,500 years, there's actually been agreement with what the Buddha found, and not out of just sort of being, you could say, good little boys and girls, good little soldiers, and just, traipsing behind the Buddha and saying, you're great, but actually on the basis of doing exactly what the Buddha asked, to please verify, validate the truth of what he proposed. And men and women have done that, but working with, again, this very verifiable entity of the mind. And it has proven that the Buddha was right. Men and women since then have found liberation, they've found peace, they've found insight, they've spontaneously, or rather they've discovered the innate disposition with all the qualities such as compassion and so forth, as you could say, spontaneously present qualities that abide within. And so this whole journey that we have in the context of the Buddha is the journey to enlightenment. But this journey, and this, again, this journey, the validity of this journey has been verified for 2,500 years. That beats, I'm sorry, any other science that you can come across in terms of either philosophy or in terms of natural sciences. But we don't actually just say, okay, if it's been going on for 2,500 years, it must be true. This is, of course, actually what happens in Buddhist cultures, like I started off saying. But in our culture, we're a bit like the people who come across the car for the first time. And we actually wonder, how on earth does that thing move? And maybe we need to feed it. And similarly, also with regards to the Buddhist teaching in the modern world, we might think, oh, well, this is religion, and we should just sort of just placidly say, yes, sir. And that's fine, we can do that for ourselves, but Buddhism won't last for very long if this is what people are doing. They won't be able to talk with their friends, their family, and other people about what they're doing, because essentially it will just be seen as religion, which for most people signifies ignorance, blind faith. And that's where we have a little bit of a problem in that sense. Of course, if we use the word religion, we can say the epistemology of that is that it means to connect with reality. So from that point of view, religion is a very good word. We could say Buddhism is a religion on that definition. But that, unfortunately, for most people in the modern world, religion means blind faith. And so if we as practitioners practice the path, and others look at us and say, what are you doing? And we can actually explain it and just say, well, my teacher, I'm a Buddhist. According to Buddhism, we do this. According to Buddhism, we think that. According to Buddhism, can you hear? It just doesn't really connect with the other person. They're just essentially seeing that you've sequestered yourself into a place where you see through things through Buddhist optics, Buddhist glasses, and that doesn't invite conversation. Whereas if we say, well, it seems to be me that I function better when I investigate and think about things rather than just react. It seems to me that I function better when my mind is peaceful. It seems to me that I'm how do you say, more compassionate when I begin to think of other people beside myself. There's no rocket science in this, but at least there's not any sense of it being something incredibly mystical. One of my friends had a revelation about a year ago, where all of a sudden he realized actually being a selfish person wasn't very helpful for his happiness. You might say, well, that's kind of obvious, isn't it? And for this person, it wasn't. And this actually constitutes a very real, you could say, topic of conversation between him and his friends. Like, hey, I discovered this thing, I discovered what a selfish bastard I was. I feel so much better now. That kind of thing, as funny and corny, as predictable as it sounds, is something that, is all about the mind, all about the intangible, and yet it makes a huge difference. So that's where, when it comes to the Buddhist teaching, it's very good if we have something that others can relate to, and also for our own sake, that we have valid knowledge. In the Buddhist teaching, for example, we visualize deity in mandala. Well, why do we do that? Is that just some sort of gimmick that we've made up? How does that help? How does that stand in relation to Zen Buddhism, which, you know, would just think that's absolutely ludicrous? That's where we need to actually have the logical science of what it means to actually see phenomena on the basis of emptiness, see the unity of appearance and emptiness, the yoga of integrating a vision of appearance and emptiness, and so forth, that enables us to actually put a handle on what it is that we're doing. And so to have a logical understanding and to have a proper science around what we're doing on the path, and also a logic around understanding ourselves and our reality and so forth, this is what we call valid cognition. And this is sometimes a little bit sort of seen as something that is potentially complex, but we're lucky here in Mipham Rinpoche's Sword of Wisdom, where Mipham Rinpoche actually makes this very accessible. I'm just going to, we're going to begin the study now, and this is just a little bit of a, you could say, an introduction. But we have really here a great classic work. And I was struck by this when I read it first time in its English translation. It's something that many of us actually already have encountered. The teachings on valid cognition are not strangers to us. But what we have here, for example, the teaching on the two truths, relative truth, absolute truth, and so forth. But what we have here is a way of actually gathering the whole range of our experience into a place where we can actually really see how this works in terms of the journey forward to enlightenment, how all our experiences actually can be understood, and what is valid under experience, what is confused experience, and so forth. This is something that will enable us tremendously to have faith in the path that we're engaging, whatever path we're practicing, and also in general to understand our own experience and understand the experience of others. So with this undertaking here, we're doing ourselves a favor. We're also doing the larger community a favor. We're gaining insight into the most essential aspect of everybody's life, which is this aspect of the mind. So, like I said, this in the presentation here from Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche, this topic that sometimes is a little bit sort of approached with some fear and trepidation, valid cognition or pramana, and it's called in Sanskrit, tsema, as it's called in Tibetan, is then here presented in these 104 verses, and we have then a commentary by Khenchen Palden Sherab. Now the commentary is quite extensive, and what I'm taking the liberty to do is actually to abbreviate it to some extent. So I'm just taking selections from it. Otherwise, it's very long, and some of the sections quite difficult really to you could say, yeah, to understand basically. So there. So anyway, with that said, for once I'll try not to forget the initial supplication. Just in the supplication to Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche. Says, through the blessing of awareness emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you opened the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of courage, thus mastering the great treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham, Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So just going to put things slightly in context here, historical context. The Buddhist teaching emerged about 600 years before the Common Era, and this era was interestingly across the planet. Sort of, it's at the same time that we had Socrates. At the same era, we had Lao Tzu, we had Zarathustra, and so on. There was various sages across the planet at that particular time. But what was really significant with the Buddha's time, as far as we're concerned in this discussion, is that it was very much a time of just simplicity and practice. The Harappan culture had already, for about 1,000 years or more, very much been practicing yoga, and there was sort of a general understanding of the spiritual. So when the Buddha emerged, really, it was very much in the context of an already existing, you could say, culture that facilitated practice. In the era that then came up into the Common Era, about 1,000 years later, there had emerged a lot of spiritual movements in India, and there was very much sort of a multi-discursive or multicultural, multi-spiritual culture, in which then the teachings of the Buddha actually required explanation. And this is the beauty of the Buddha's teaching. It has always adapted according to the times and the needs of beings. And that's where there then was a need to engage with others, that there was actually conversations taking place between the different systems. And so that's where then the likes are, rather, you have a whole slew of great commentators that then clarified the Buddha's teaching, beginning with Nagarjuna, and then also followed by people like Aryadeva, and then you have Asanga, Vasubandhu, and so forth, who clarified, on one hand, what we call ontology, or you could say the understanding of reality, and then also, particularly from Dignaga and someone called Dharmakirti, we then have this science of epistemology validating our particular view, and that is important. If you can't just say, well, in the name of religion, I'm going to go over in my corner and I'm going to believe what I believe, and the rest of you, I don't care about you. We can't do that. Also, we don't do in science. We can't just say, well, I believe this is how the bridge should be built, and then somebody else says, I believe this is how it should be built. We need to see who actually is going to build the bridge that lasts, whose knowledge is valid. And so similarly also with the spiritual, you can't just say, well, this is what I'm doing. There has to be a conversation. And this is where we in the modern world have the problem with fundamentalism, even under the sort of the banner of religious freedom, that there's no conversations going on. You can just believe anything you like, however completely sort of illogical it is. So the valid cognition is where we look at, is our propositions, is it actually something that flies? Is it valid? So this tradition then emerged then in India in the context of, you say, the conversations that were being had at that time. So we have someone particularly famous, and I'm just really going to mention, I'm just mentioning him here for the name, which is Dharmakirti. So he was, we generally refer to him as a Yogacharya, and also then we have the ones that he actually followed, which was somebody called Dignaga. But they essentially developed this system of valid cognition epistemology, pramana. And one of the things that they would use, and this actually it's not particularly Yogacharan, it's more what we call Sautantika, but on the basis of this conversations that they would have, they, for example, would distinguish between what we generally understand as a thing. Let's say I say table, you know what I'm thinking, but then again, there's the more specific table that I'm looking at here. And they discovered that very often the way that we relate to the world is really just on the basis of our ideas and the way that we project onto phenomena. And they say, well, the phenomena itself actually is untouched by the way that you're seeing it. Already there, we're coming across some very interesting observations with regards to how, for example, we judge others. We can't judge on appearances. We have to know the more particulars or the specifics. So anyway, this is really just mentioning briefly Dharmakirti, and I'm now going to go on to the text. This is taken from the Mipam Limited course that I'm running, that will be continuing tomorrow. But we'll now look at the actual text. I want to just highlight a few things from Anne Helm's introduction. And I don't know Anne Helm, but I gather she is somebody who definitely reading her translation here, very good. And someone who also some of the other people that she's referring to and so on, very reliable, great, you could say, practitioners and scholars. So I'm very, you could say, pleased that we have this translation from Anne Helm. And I just wanted to take a few points from her introduction, where one place she says, perhaps the greatest value of this very rich classical text is in bringing a clear and concise primer on Buddhist philosophy and valid cognition. Its core subject matter is the Buddhist view of the two truths, the relative truth of conventional appearances and the absolute truth of emptiness and Buddha nature, and how the two truths are inseparable. The main questions of the text poses, how can we actually know the two truths, and how can we be certain that our knowledge is accurate? So that's what we're doing here. She says this book excels in giving an easily understandable overview of valid cognition. What is valid cognition? It is accurate knowing, which we experience through direct perception and correct inference. She also says another feature of the classical Tibetan teaching style, and this we're going to see here a little bit, but the thing is, it won't be, I don't think it will be overwhelming. That's where sometimes it can be a little bit tough going with a lot of categories. But here I would say it's fairly manageable. So we'd say the classical Tibetan teaching style is sort of defined by its many categories and perspectives on a topic. For example, the two truths are discussed according to their essences, definitions, characteristics, functions, and purposes. So that's where we can say the relative truth. What is the essence of relative truth? Well, it is that is it's deceptive, it's flawed. Definitions, well, we can define it in terms of how it lacks clarity, it lacks prajna, it lacks direct insight. Characteristics is, well, we can say it creates suffering, it creates inability to see clearly. It functions, well, among functions, it perpetrates suffering. And purposes, well, as far as purpose goes, we can say it has the sole sort of effective function and purpose to, you could say, perpetuate samsara, and so forth. These are not what I just mentioned here, sort of some pretty mediocre examples, but really just to give an example of what we mean then when we have these kind of classifications, yeah, essence, definitions, characteristics, etc. So Anne Helm says, as we go through these categories, looking at the two truths from all these different angles, it becomes more and more apparent what they entail. Understanding comes about from having several ways of approaching and contemplating the same topic. So this is where we then, when we understand something from so many different angles, then this is an important point, then we're completely at ease with what we actually mean. Then, you know, your nephew can wake you up at 2 a.m. and say, well, what does it all mean? And you'll actually be able to say, well, you know, it depends on how you're seeing it, depends on the mind, and no relative truth, absolute truth. But you have that ease and confidence with regards to the nature of the path and what you're doing. It's transparent, and you also see it reflected in the realities around you. Then she says, for example, more specifically about this book, she says, one way of looking at the two truths is to divide them into the pure and impure relative and the inexpressible and inexpressible absolute. This is something that we come across particularly in the Vajrayana, where we talk about pure relative truth. And that stands in opposition to impure relative truth, which is how ordinary beings see. So pure relative truth is seeing reality without, seeing relative truth, but seeing it without an ordinary, you could say, projections of a confused individual. And impure is seeing it according to our ordinary way of fixating on things. So that's the ordinary, the scope of the ordinary. Impure is the scope of the, you could say, undiluted. Expressible and inexpressible absolute. Again, this is where we can understand emptiness logically, but then there's the experience of emptiness, which is inexpressible, and so forth. So Anne Helm says, this way of discussing the two truths is a special feature of Mipham Rinpoche's view, which follows Shantarakshita's view in the adornment of the middle way. This very insightful presentation is particularly upheld by the Nyingma lineage. So this is where we had, when Buddhism was brought to Tibet, this was the, you could say, the foundations of the Buddhist tradition, the Vinaya and the dialectic traditions of the Mahayana in general, was brought to Tibet by the great abbot Shantarakshita. It was then on the basis of his advice to the king Tritsum Detsen that the Tibetans invited Padmasambhava to Tibet. So he's a key person in the Tibetan Buddhism. We would say one of the founding fathers, really, of Tibetan Buddhism, but also a giant within in India. Anyway, so in this way, just a few points from Anne Helm's introduction. Okay. So we're now going to look at the actual text. We're going to look at this Sherab Relchi, the Sword of Wisdom from Jamgon Rinpoche. And then also, like I said, there's not taking all of the commentary, but I'll select what I think will be useful for us here. Kenshin Sherab Palden's commentary, Radiant Light of the Sun and Moon. So, as you can imagine, then there's a few verses of homage that precede the actual topic. So I think we can go through this today. So first, there's homage to Manjushri and Padmasambhava in union in the sense of being inseparable. Namo Shri Vajra Padma Tikshnaya. Homage to the glorious and sharp Vajra lotus. Homage to Shakyamuni Buddha, with the chariot of the wind of the two accumulations. Sorry, this. With the chariot of the winds of the two accumulations, you led the 4 divisions of the troops of the 10 powers to victory in battle over the gods of desire. With the sharp fangs and claws of the 4 fearlessnesses, you swallowed all at once the elephant brains of antagonistic proponents of eternalism and nihilism. By abiding on the snow mountains of knowing the nature and entire extent of phenomena, you destroyed the darkness of the 2 obscurations through the 2 yogic disciplines. In the center of a 1,000-spoke wheel, among humans, you are exalted like a lion. You are called Siddhartha, since you have accomplished all aims. Please bring forth auspiciousness. Excuse me. Homage to Padmasambhava. Shining with 1,000 luminous marks of deathlessness, you sprang forth from a lotus blossom in the center of a lake. Nasisilan Yamanakaya, who outshines all apparent existence, please be the crown jewel that beautifies my head until I am fully enlightened. Homage to Manjushri. On the tip of the anthers of a 1,000-petal lotus of devotion, Lord of Dharma, I continue to reverently pay homage to you. Mawe Senge, ever youthful line of speech, please bestow the light of intelligence on all beings everywhere. Homage to Saraswati. With 100,000 melodious words of the noble Dharma, you beautify a garden of lotuses in full bloom, the throats of all the Buddhas. Saraswati, graceful swan, glowing with the luster of moonlight, playfully cruise at this time through the lake of my mind. And then there's the Khenpo's homage to Jamgon Rinpoche. Your arrogant and vicious opponents, like 1,000 elephants, are overpowered, even without study or contemplation, by your laughing roar of reasoning. O lion of speech, Vivam Chola Namjal, may you be victorious. And then homage to the root teacher. With a sharp Vajra weapon of scripture and reasoning, you overpower your opponents, who resemble arrogant, jealous gods. Glorious teacher, who kindly helps me see the excellent, genuine path. Like the king of the gods, may you be ever victorious. So, with regards to this homage here, I would say it's indispensable really for you to follow this course, unless you actually have the book. So you can get this as Kindle and so forth. And in the Kindle edition, you have then footnotes. Some of these footnotes I'll be going over, but some, like for example, reading the homage here, it would be, you wouldn't get very far if we were to sort of, go over every aspect of like the four fearlessnesses and so forth. So that's where I'm just leaving it at that. So just one thing to say when we talk about for example, arrogant and vicious opponents, and that is very often you could say when we're talking about the spiritual, it's just like with any science. There needs to be a very clear understanding of truth, and so that's where it's important really that we get it right, and that's where sometimes there can be some heated arguments. That's where you could say someone like Mipa Rinpoche was really somebody who did tremendous favor to the Buddhist teaching in really being remarkable in terms of his gentleness, with his style. He was very gentle and non-confrontational, and yet also very clear in his logic. And so we rely on Mipa Rinpoche as someone who really embodies this capacity of prajna that sort of cuts through confusion. And it's very important that we cut through confusion, that we don't settle just for something just because it's our particular tradition or somebody says that it's right. We have to really be willing to use, you could say, inquiry, analysis. So that's where we then, you could say, we need to apply this sort of what we can call the sharp Vajra weapons of reasoning and scripture and so on. So we'll look a bit more at that here. So the validity of the teachings and the teacher. And we'll just do the first few lines of this here where it says, the Sword of Wisdom, the present work, has 3 sections. The start of the composition makes it good in the beginning. The main part makes it good in the middle, and the conclusion makes it good at the end. So this is how we always define the Buddha's teaching. It's good in the beginning, middle, and end. There's nothing not to like about it at any given point. The beginning section includes a verse of homage, followed by a verse stating the author's promise. So the first of these, the verse of homage. This philosophy is unmistaken. All errors have been eliminated. The mind is free from doubts about 3 points. I pay homage to Manjushri, the treasure of wisdom. So as you know, all Buddhist scriptures, and particularly or commentaries, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, as per the decree actually of someone called Chi Rinpoche, actually would always say you have to have homage at the beginning, partly also so you know which category the teaching belongs to. So when we bow down to the Bodhisattva Manjushri, we know this is teachings on the Prajnaparamita or the Abhidharma. So here then, this is, we're presently studying what is referred to as philosophy. But we'll see what is meant by that. The Khenpo says, the word philosophy is drawn from the Sanskrit siddhanta, or sometimes we say siddhanta. Philosophy is connected with ultimate reality. It refers to a system of assertions that are made with certainty because they come from investigating and analyzing through scripture and reasoning. It reaches a final conclusion for which nothing further needs be posited. A philosophy is unmistaken if it accords with the true nature of things, and mistaken if it cannot be proven to accord with the way things are. Now this is where Buddhist, what we call then philosophy, for lack of a better word really, is a bit more rigorous than what we sometimes refer to as philosophy in the West. There's not a lot of speculation. It's very much more, you could say, again, epistemically, it's more along the lines of what we call science. So while it is about the mind, and as such, probably we wouldn't call it science in the modern world, when we say philosophy, we should be aware that it's a bit more than just, you could say, thoughts as such, but very much, again, abiding by a rigor, which we're going to be looking at, and that is where we essentially operate with 3 aspects of validation. What is what we can directly observe, what we can logically infer. And when there are things that possibly lie beyond our scope, then we refer to what we can call authoritative sources or scripture. And that is, for example, again, coming back to the distance from here to the moon, then I understand that this is the data we have around that is not based on belief. It doesn't come down from a scripture. It's based on actual valid ways of measuring. And that's where I would assume, even though I don't do it myself, I would assume that the science behind this is about what is directly observable and verifiable. And I do that because, and that's where I then use, you could say, logical inference, is that through my culture, my education, and so forth, I've come to trust some of these institutions of science. They just seem to be just right. And for that reason, also, then they become what I then refer to as authoritative scripture. Whatever JPL or NASA they might say, this is then what I choose to trust. So again, these are all about us finding ways in which the best way that we can validate things. And of course, in the Buddhist teaching, then we're not just about what we can observe out there, but also about what's happening in the mind. And that's also where we can say, well, I can see there's anger, and I can see that this anger, it is that immediate anger is happening on the basis of a particular object. And I can see I can then validate, well, is that object really what I project onto it? So that's where I'm using, on one hand, I'm using direct observation. I'm also on the basis of the object, I'm seeing the object, and I'm also beginning to understand how logically this object can be seen from different angles. Let's say there's a person I don't like, other people might see this person differently. And that's where I can logically infer that that person might not necessarily exist the way that I'm seeing him or her. And also then I can pick up words from the Dalai Lama that says, try to see the goodness in all persons, and just because it's the Dalai Lama who sees that, and I'm kind of I kind of trust the Dalai Lama and so forth, I'll try it out, and I'll say, okay, try to see the good things in all people. Well, that person I don't like seems to be very nice to animals, and seems to be overall in many other ways a nice person. And that's where you'd say we also trust, we can make use of, to some extent, then scripture. But as we will see here, a lot of what we're looking at here is very much about validation through the two first kinds, which are what we can directly observe and what we can infer logically. Another way of explaining that is fire. You can directly see there's a fire. You might not be able to see the fire, but then you can see behind the hill or whatever, you can see smoke coming up. So while you can't see the fire, you can see a sign of the fire. And that's then what we call inference. That's then logical inference. So in that way, we can base our knowledge not because somebody says it, and not because it's we'd like to think in a particular way, but we can really experience it. And that's also where you will see then a sage doesn't just sit and talk about things mumbo jumbo that has nothing to do with the world, but they very much speak. You can see and you can assert what the validity of what they're saying. So we're very much operating within the real world, and that is then the purpose of valid cognition, that what we are looking at in terms of the mind, in terms of working with the mind and so forth, is not something that is mumbo jumbo, not something that is about just blind faith, but very much what is about what we can really assert in terms of our direct experience. Okay, let's see if there's some questions here. Good. When people ask me why I'm practicing Buddhism at my advanced age, I just say it makes sense. That's good. And then they probably say, why does it make sense? And they become interested. And that's what is so good. Yeah, it makes sense of everything. That's good. And then you can engage them in conversation saying why it makes sense. And see, that's where by you saying it makes sense, you don't say because, because I like the Dalai Lama's face or something like that, which might also be a valid statement. But it opens up for conversation, and it opens up in which the others feel, you could say, that we're sharing a common ground of what we can validate. Yeah. So there's also something you could say very compassionate about the study of valid cognition. It doesn't just close off, like this is what I choose to do, and I have the right to do so. But exactly, it makes sense, and that's where the others then will say, well, yes, yes, tell us, how does it make sense? And then we can say, well, it makes sense in terms of I can see how my own mind is something that's not either good or bad, but it's something where I can work with the mind. I can eliminate confusion. I can see clearer, and it enables me to move gentler in the world, or whatever we might choose to be. We, of course, there's no set formula for this, but the beauty of it is that it opens up for conversation in terms of establishing something where there's a ground of trust with the others, and also this gives us so much more faith in terms of the path. Otherwise, the path might be a slog. You sometimes hear people say, "Oh, I have to do my practice," and you can see it's sort of like, "I have to do it," and it's there has to be this. Is like, it's like eating or drinking or brushing our teeth. So the paper book doesn't have the footnotes references? Yeah, it does. Yeah. So you have all the, and I will draw them in, but just presently, and also I'll be unpacking things, but yeah, it's all there. Okay, someone says, bring on the sword. Let's do this. Again, the beauty of this sword is, what we mean with the sword. It is the sword of prajna. And we could say what holds us in samsara is essentially deception. It's just confusion. So the sword of prajna is that which cuts through confusion. It's what enables us to see that the fact that what looks like a snake, in fact, is just a rope. So that's where clarity comes in. There you are, just about to purchase your shares in the Eiffel Tower, and then your friend comes in with the sword of wisdom saying, mate, you're being taken for a ride. You go, really? But the man seems very nice. But so we need to bring on the sword. Sometimes I don't have the words to my experience, but suppose that comes with sharing. Yeah, it does actually. Very often conversation and talking actually enables us to, clarify things. And I mean, it's not about our experience particularly. It's about, just say the nature of our reality. I mean, we all have different experiences, right? But we can talk about what we share with others, Isn't it interesting that things work out much better in a conflict when we speak gently? That, for example, that's a valid statement. And why is that? Well, when we don't put others on the defensive and so forth. All that kind of stuff operates within validation of felt experience and shared experience. So that's where it's rather helpful to understand what we're doing here, and particularly when it comes to the two truths, to understand the difference between how we can conventionally speak of things in a particular way, but they might not exist the way that we think they do. And that's where we can open up for much greater much greater insight. And that, of course, also is what we mean with philosophy, in the sense of being in concordance with what is real. So, for example, the moment that we are working in the garden, it doesn't help that we just have a feeling and say, I'd like to plant this here or do that. Then it might be helpful to actually have a science that says, well, we should analyze the soil, or we should have some idea of the soil, of what kind of vegetables grow in this particular soil. And that we don't really call philosophy. But in fact, what we mean with philosophy here is actually beginning to have something that have an insight into the, you say, the landscape of our experience. So philosophy is a little bit sort of philosophy usually comes with sort of the idea of some highfalutin, abstract ideas. And what we have here when we use the word philosophy is just a translation of the Tibetan word drumta, or in Sanskrit Siddhanta, where drumta, I think, would just means what we conclude about what is valid. So conclusions we make about what is valid. And that's where the what we are applying here is very much this analysis. So we're using then scripture and reasoning, we're using what we can directly observe, what we can infer, and also to some extent then, of course, drawing on the statements from, say, scripture in the sense of from the Buddha, from sages. Yeah. Also, what's very helpful in terms with regards to the sages is that then down through the times, 2,500 years again, sages have validated what the Buddha had said. So there's particular statements that are difficult to understand in terms of how karma works over lifetimes, or the all ground and so forth. That's why it's very helpful that other sages have validated what it was the Buddha spoke about. Okay, the validity of the teachings will continue here. Now, of course, I hope you appreciate, I'm sorry we haven't gotten that far, but I think some of the things that we've talked on today is essential, particularly for us living in the modern culture. Some of the things that you normally would already have in place if you've been brought up in a Buddhist culture just isn't really in place when it comes to our cultural context. And a lot of potential misunderstandings are already, you could say, we have potential for misunderstandings around something like the path and the nature of the path in the modern world. So I think it always makes sense to a little bit sort of draw the discussion into a context that relates to our modern situation. Okay. As for the homage part, is it a collection of homages from different people? Why homage to Jamgon Mipa Rinpoche? From a student of Mipa Rinpoche said, may you be victorious. Isn't Mipa Rinpoche already victorious? It's a homage to yeah, it's some of it was written by Mipa Rinpoche, some like the homage to Guru Rinpoche, I think also to the Buddha and so on. And some of them are homages then from Khenpo and Sherpa Palden. So may you be victorious is really just may your aspirations in terms of your enlightened activity, may they be fulfilled. So yeah. So Mipa Rinpoche, actually Mipa literally does mean victorious. It means undefeated. Pamba means to be defeated. Mipamba means never defeated. So yeah, it's also one of the names of the Buddha Maitreya. But yes, so so yeah. Okay, well, if there's no further questions, then we'll conclude at this point. Thank you so much, and see you next week. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning. May we cross the ocean of existence in that life, thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world. May we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.